right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to talk about Errol Spence Jr., Keith Thurman, and Terence Crawford, and follow up on something that Tim Smith said. I did a little bit of digging, and I do believe that I know what the source of a lot of this. Terence Crawford isn't worth the money and isn't going to get an offer from PBC. I think that I've got a little bit behind the politics on that. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. Before I get into the video though, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. Hit the bell icon so that you can be notified of when we release more videos. And also, please watch the video all the way to the end and hit the like button. So with that said, let's get into the welterweight division and Errol Spence Jr., Terence Crawford fight saga, and a little bit of an update from some sources that I have about why the PBC may not want to make the Terence Crawford fight, and why guys like Tim Smith are saying that, using words like the numbers that Terence Crawford has historically would mean that this fight, they could not offer him what they want to offer him, right? Now, my sources tell me this, and this is, a lot of this stuff is just out there in the open so people can see. Some of the other stuff is people that I talk to. Errol Spence Jr. is probably one of the only guys at the PBC that really wants the Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight. Errol Spence Jr. wants that fight. My understanding is, however, that other people in the PBC would rather have Errol Spence Jr. fight Keith Thurman. Now, the logic behind this is that Keith, just like Tim Smith said, and I'll give you just a little bit of a background, earlier this week or over this weekend, Tim Smith, who is the director of communications for the PBC, was asked what the roadblocks are to a fight between Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford. And he said it is basically the finances associated with it, and that Terence Crawford, the numbers that he has historically don't really justify those guys making a big offer to him, right? Now, when I heard that, I thought to myself, okay, this is Tim Smith. Tim Smith is the director of communications for the PBC. His job is to work with the media and get the messages out that the PBC wants to have out, right? And so the message that the PBC wanted to have out was obviously that Terence Crawford, he's a tremendous talent, but his numbers do not really justify them making a very big offer to him. Now, where have we heard the same stuff before? We hear it related to Gervonta Tank Davis and Devin Haney, Gervonta Tank Davis and Lomachenko, Gervonta Tank Davis and Teofimo Lopez. That pretty much the same thing that Leonard Ellerbe said about making big fights, and people saying, hey, some of these fights that people really think are really big aren't really that as big as they think because their numbers aren't as good, right? So Tim Smith has pretty much said the same thing that Leonard Ellerbe did about overpaying for Terence Crawford. Like Leonard Ellerbe talked about like how much specifically Devin Haney was going to want to make $5 million for the fight, and there's not $5 million in that fight, right? But at the end of it though, they do have an idea of who they want Errol Spence Jr. to fight and who they think will generate enough money for Errol Spence Jr., right? Now, the reason why I called and asked people about it was somebody on my chat, shout out to you, mentioned like, what is it about Terence Crawford's numbers that is so much lower than Sean Porter's numbers, right? Or Danny Garcia's numbers. And I thought to myself, yeah, that's a real good point, because I don't really think we had a measuring stick on what the pay-per-view numbers would be, historically for Danny Garcia, because Danny Garcia had never been on pay-per-view. Sean Porter, same thing. Before Errol Spence Jr., he wasn't on pay-per-view. Same thing for same thing with Mikey Garcia. Mikey Garcia had not been on pay-per-view before he fought Errol Spence Jr. So not quite sure, what the difference was between Errol Spence Jr. between those guys that Errol fought, right? Mikey Garcia, Sean Porter, and Danny Garcia, and Terence Crawford. And in fact, if you look at the numbers related to Terence Crawford actually has more pay-per-view, actually legit pay-per-view sales out there than the other guys did, because they had never actually been targeted. And so what's the difference? Well, obviously the difference is that those guys were advised by Al Heyman. They were PBC fighters, and what you have is the ability to have where you have him. You do not have to pay a different promoter. You can find different ways to work through it. So it seems to me that it was the only difference is that those guys were PBC fighters and Terence Crawford isn't a PBC fighter. Now, what I'm hearing is that the guy that many people in the PBC really want to make their pay-per-view fight after the Yordanis Ugas with Errol Spence is Keith Thurman. So Keith Thurman would fight Mario Barrios, and then after that, Keith Thurman would fight Errol Spence Jr. However, here is the big holdup, right? And also remember, Errol Spence Jr. is the one talking about strap season. Errol Spence Jr. is the one talking about how he wants the belts. He wants all of the belts. That is not the movement of, like, for example, Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Gervonta Davis, where they're saying, look, man, we don't want to pay all that money for those belts, right? So the man, and I understand some people are saying that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not part of the PBC, that they're totally separate and all that. You know, I'm not buying it. If they are totally separate legal entities, okay. However, you know, the fruit does not fall from the tree. Leonard Ellerbe, Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Al Heyman work together very closely, have been together very closely, and their viewpoint on how to make money and what pay-per-views and all that stuff to do have got to be very similar. So in essence, if Errol Spence Jr. is going to make the fight with Terence Crawford, and Terence Crawford is serious about making the fight, more than likely Terence Crawford is going to have to take that lesser percentage, and so that Errol Spence Jr. can actually force these guys into making the fight that he wants. Now, because Errol Spence Jr. is a champion, he is a big money draw, so he definitely has a say-so as far as what he wants to do in his career. And if he is really, really adamant about fighting Terence Crawford, and also very adamant about not fighting Keith Thurman, because that's what the other side of it with Errol Spence Jr. and Keith Thurman is, that Errol Spence Jr. does not want to fight Keith Thurman because Keith Thurman had held him off and stopped the fight and all that stuff, right? But, you know, Al Heyman is an advisor and manager of Keith Thurman. So he's looking out for Keith Thurman, and he's looking out for Errol Spence Jr. If you look at, you know, the argument, and even what, you know, Terence Crawford says about Keith Thurman, he's like, look, Keith Thurman is a bigger fight than, at one point in time, he thought that Terence Crawford thought Keith Thurman was a bigger fight than Errol Spence Jr. was. He definitely still said recently that he thinks Keith Thurman is a bigger fight than Sean Porter is, right? And Keith Thurman also has an advantage of being somebody that will actually go out and sell a fight. He's got the type of mouthpiece that is going to be able to sell and get people interested in the fight. He also did a good pay-per-view, I think like a 450,000 pay-per-view, being the B-side to Manny Pacquiao, and those guys feel like they can probably get the same numbers with Errol Spence Jr. and Keith Thurman because of Keith Thurman's, you know, ability to sell a fight. So, you know, the long and short of it is, man, is I think, you know, I'm not going to write off Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford fighting. I just think that Terence Crawford is going to have to give Errol Spence Jr. a little help on that, you know, as far as the money that he's looking for to get past the objections, the internal objections of the PBC. And maybe what he can do is say, hey, man, I want a rematch clause. In the rematch clause, we can split the percentages, something like that. But whatever the case is, it looks like, you know, that Terence Crawford is going to have to help Errol Spence Jr. out a little bit on, you know, that stance that I'm not going to fight for nothing less than 50-50, because 50-50 means 50 leaves the PBC, right? And versus where somebody like, you know, Keith Thurman, because he has the same manager, he has the same advisor, they have the same internal setup. The costs aren't the same thing for Keith Thurman. So there's a little bit of that cost competitiveness, man. So, at the end of the day, man, I'm hoping that Terence Crawford, really wants this fight and really wants the Errol Spence Jr. fight enough to, kind of maybe back up a little bit on his initial financial demands. Otherwise, my understanding is that other people involved with it would just as quickly go to Keith Thurman and make a safe bet on an internal pay-per-view with Keith Thurman. But anyway, that's my take on the situation. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.